I couldn't believe my ears. The words she spoke stung like 1,000 needles, sharp and precise, echoing in my mind long after they were uttered. "You're a terrible cook," my mother-in-law said, her voice dripping with disdain. The room fell silent for a moment. The smell of the freshly baked casserole, which I had poured my heart into preparing, seemed to hang in the air like a mockery of my efforts. The warmth from the oven still lingered, but the warmth in my chest had quickly vanished, replaced with an icy knot of frustration and embarrassment. I looked around the dinner table, where my husband, the man who had promised to stand by me through thick and thin, was uncharacteristically quiet. His eyes were downcast, avoiding mine. And my mother-in-law? She had the audacity to smirk as she made her scathing remark, her fork poised in the air, the same fork that had just barely scraped through the casserole that I had carefully prepared for hours. What was I supposed to do? The mother of my husband, the woman who had raised him, had just called me out in front of everyone, making me feel like the worst cook on the planet. I had never been one to back down, but this time I felt powerless. The taste of the food, the effort, the love I had poured into making everything just perfect. Nothing mattered anymore. But I wasn't going to let her win. Not yet. It was late that night when I finally found the courage to speak to my husband about what had happened. We sat in the dimly lit living room, the soft glow from the TV illuminating his face, though his mind was clearly somewhere else. I could see it in his eyes. He was torn between his loyalty to his mother and his love for me. I hated seeing him like this, caught in the middle. "Did you hear what she said?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and anger. He sighed, his gaze drifting to the floor. "I know. I heard it." His tone was soft, almost apologetic. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," I snapped, then softened. "But I need you to understand how much that hurt." He looked at me, and for a brief moment I saw the frustration in his eyes. "I know my mom can be difficult sometimes, but you know how she is. You shouldn't take it personally." I couldn't believe it. He was defending her. I stood up, pacing around the room. "I don't care if she's difficult or if this is her style. She made me feel like I was completely useless in this house, like I was a failure." My hands clenched into fists, the memory of her words still so fresh. "And I'm not going to let her get away with it." "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice laced with curiosity and concern. I turned to face him, a determined look in my eyes. "I'm going to show her exactly what I'm capable of." The next few days were filled with tension. I spent hours in the kitchen, perfecting my recipes and experimenting with flavors that would blow her away. I wasn't just cooking to prove her wrong. I was cooking to show her that I could be better than what she thought of me. I made a plan. The next family dinner, I would be in charge. She wouldn't be able to criticize me anymore. The days dragged on as I worked tirelessly, preparing my meals with precision, pouring every ounce of my energy into them. But it wasn't just about the food. No, this was about something much bigger. It was about me standing up for myself, not letting her words define who I was or my worth as a woman. I was more than just a terrible cook. I was capable of greatness, and it was time to prove it. The night before the dinner, I stayed up late, practicing the finishing touches on my dishes. My hands were covered in flour, my apron stained, but I didn't care. It was all going to be worth it. Tomorrow, I would serve the meal of a lifetime. The day arrived, and with it, the feeling of anticipation that had been building inside me for days. My heart raced as I prepared the table, arranging everything meticulously. The dining room was perfectly set, the candles glowing softly, casting shadows across the walls. It looked like something out of a magazine, a scene of elegance and sophistication. But I couldn't help but feel the weight of the challenge ahead of me. This was my chance to change everything. As my mother-in-law and husband entered the room, her eyes immediately scanned the table. I could see the subtle disapproval forming on her face, the way her lips tightened, and her eyes darted from plate to plate, searching for imperfections. "Well, let's see if you've improved," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I stood tall, refusing to let her get under my skin this time. "You'll be the judge," I replied, my voice steady. The dinner began, and I watched as they all took their first bites. My heart pounded as I waited for their reactions. It was in that moment that I realized how much I needed this, how much I needed to feel validated. It wasn't just about her approval. It was about reclaiming my confidence. Then, the silence settled in. The clinking of silverware on plates seemed to echo, and I could feel the tension building. "Wow," my husband said, breaking the silence. This is amazing." My mother-in-law, who had been silently scrutinizing the food, suddenly looked up at me, her expression unreadable. For a moment I thought she might say something negative, but then her eyes softened. She took another bite, and then another, each time pausing, her eyebrows raising in surprise. "All right, I admit it," she said, her tone surprisingly humble. You've outdone yourself." The words I had been waiting to hear, the validation I had craved. But it wasn't just about her admission. It was about the moment when I realized that I had proven something to myself, that I didn't need her approval to feel worthy. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur, filled with small conversations and laughter, but I couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. My mother-in-law had finally acknowledged my effort. She had finally recognized me for who I was, not just the woman who married her son, but someone capable of greatness. It wasn't about cooking. It never had been. It was about the realization that sometimes the hardest battles we face aren't with others, they're with ourselves. The constant pressure to meet expectations, to fit into a mold that others create for us. But I had proven that I didn't have to live up to anyone's expectations but my own. I had shown her, yes, but more importantly, I had shown myself. As I cleaned up the dishes later that night, my husband came up to me, a proud smile on his face. "You did it," he said softly. I smiled, a sense of peace washing over me. No, we did it. Together. And just like that, the battle had been won, not with words but with action. I had faced the criticism, the judgment, and had come out victorious. It wasn't about the food anymore. It was about reclaiming my power, my worth, and my confidence. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly proud of myself. I knew I wasn't a terrible cook. I knew I was so much more than that. And I would never forget that lesson. The next few days were a blur of emotions, but in the best possible way. Every free moment I had, I spent in the kitchen. I wasn't just cooking for the sake of it. I was cooking to prove a point. My heart beat with determination as I chopped, stirred, and seasoned. Each dish became a step in my personal revolution. I made a list, a menu, if you will, that would blow my mother-in-law's mind. Dishes that not only tasted exquisite, but looked like something you'd see in a fine dining restaurant. I wasn't going to settle for mediocrity. This dinner had to be perfection, and I was going to deliver. One dish stood out among the others, a rich, buttery lobster bisque that had been passed down in my family. It was delicate, fragrant, with just the right balance of spices, and every spoonful was a memory. I could already picture it on the table, its creamy texture, the swirl of perfectly seasoned cream, the subtle scent of herbs that would linger in the air. This was my crown jewel, my piece de resistance. Then there was the dessert, a dark chocolate souffle with a molten center that would melt perfectly on the tongue, topped with a dusting of gold leaf and served with a side of homemade vanilla bean ice cream. Every single detail of this meal would prove to her, and to myself, that I was capable of far more than she gave me credit for. But it wasn't just about the food. It was about me taking control of my own narrative. I wasn't going to let her words define me. This dinner wasn't just a meal, it was a statement. A statement about resilience, strength, and the will to push back against judgment. The night before the big dinner, I stood in my kitchen, ingredients spread out before me like a battlefield. My apron was soaked in flour, my hands raw from kneading dough and stirring sauces. The clock on the wall ticked down the minutes as I adjusted the seasoning on the lobster bisque, tasted the creamy frosting for the souffle, and checked the oven for the third time. It wasn't just about the quality of the dishes anymore. It was about my mental state. I needed to be calm, composed, and confident. I couldn't afford to let my nerves get the better of me. As I prepped the final dish, a perfectly roasted rack of lamb, I thought back to the last dinner. The moment my mother-in-law had insulted my cooking was still fresh in my mind, but now it felt like fuel. Every insult, every criticism had pushed me to work harder, to rise higher. This dinner would be my redemption. Around midnight, I paused and looked around the kitchen. It was immaculate. The meal was coming together beautifully, each dish reflecting my effort and love. The hours I'd spent crafting the perfect meal weren't just about food. They were about proving that I, too, could contribute something invaluable to this family. I took a deep breath, wiped my hands on my apron, and smiled. Tomorrow would be the day that everything changed. The dinner was set. The candles flickered softly, casting shadows that danced around the room. My mother-in-law arrived fashionably late, as usual, her eyes scanning the table immediately. I noticed how she paused for a moment, her gaze narrowing in scrutiny. But this time, something was different. The air around her was charged, heavy with anticipation. This wasn't the same woman who had so easily dismissed my cooking before. "Well, she said, her voice laced with disbelief as she took in the feast before her. "It seems you've outdone yourself." I could hear the skepticism in her tone, but I wasn't going to let it faze me. She would have to eat her words. Literally. My hands were steady as I placed the lobster bisque in front of her, watching as she delicately dipped her spoon into the soup. The silence was deafening. She took the first bite. Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment I dared to hope. Could it be? Had I really done it? She took another spoonful, then another, and another. Her gaze flickered to my husband, who was watching intently, and then back to the soup. Her lips parted, as if she were about to say something, but then she stopped herself. I held my breath. "Okay," she said slowly, setting her spoon down with a soft clink. "This is actually quite good. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless." My heart soared in my chest, but I didn't let it show. This was just the beginning. The dinner progressed, each dish more impressive than the last. The lamb was tender, the souffle was light as air with the perfect molten center. My husband's face lit up as he tasted the food, and his praise made my heart swell with pride. But it wasn't just him I was cooking for. It was for me. It was for the woman who had doubted me, the one who had made me feel small, insignificant. As the meal came to a close, my mother-in-law sat back in her chair, clearly impressed. Her eyes were no longer filled with judgment, but something else, something I couldn't quite place. Was it admiration? Respect? For the first time, she seemed genuinely pleased with what I had served. "You've really come a long way," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "I have to admit, I didn't think you had it in you." My stomach flipped as I realized something. This wasn't just about food. This wasn't even about her admitting that she was wrong. No, this was about the realization that I had changed her perception of me. I had taken control of my own narrative, showing her and myself that I was capable of far more than anyone had ever imagined. But it wasn't just about cooking. It was about standing up for myself, against the weight of criticism, against the judgment, and against the feeling that I was never good enough. And in that moment, I knew I had finally proven myself. As the evening wound down, I cleared the table, my heart still racing. My mother-in-law and husband were engaged in quiet conversation, their voices a soft hum in the background. I found myself smiling as I worked, the sense of pride in my chest almost overwhelming. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, my husband turned to me with a look of admiration. "You really showed her," he said, a proud smile on his face. "I think she was shocked." I chuckled softly. I think she was more than shocked. She was impressed. He wrapped his arms around me, holding me close. "You're amazing. You know that?" I nodded, feeling a wave of contentment wash over me. It wasn't just about the approval of others. It was about knowing, deep down, that I was enough. And that, no matter what anyone said, I had the power to change my own story. Tomorrow would be another day. But for now, I was at peace. And that's all that mattered. The days leading up to the dinner felt like an emotional roller coaster, but instead of sinking under the pressure, I started to thrive. Every time I felt my confidence falter, I would remember my mother-in-law's words, and I would push myself harder. I wasn't just cooking a meal, I was creating an experience. Each ingredient I added to my dishes carried the weight of my determination, my desire to prove myself, and my deep need to be seen and valued. The sound of chopping vegetables, the sizzle of butter in the pan, and the hum of the oven became my sanctuary. It was in those moments, surrounded by the fragrances of freshly baked bread and simmering sauces, that I realized something profound. I was no longer cooking to impress my mother-in-law. I was cooking to impress myself. For so long I had allowed others to dictate my worth, but now I was reclaiming it. By the time the night of the dinner finally arrived, I had meticulously prepared each dish, ensuring everything would be perfect. My lobster bisque simmered on the stove, its creamy texture thickening just as I had envisioned. The lamb, marinated for hours, was perfectly seasoned, ready to be roasted to a golden brown perfection. I had baked a light and airy souffle, topped with a rich dark chocolate ganache, and paired it with a homemade raspberry coulis. But it wasn't just the food that mattered, it was the atmosphere I was creating. I had arranged the table with care, each place setting neatly positioned, the candles flickering softly to set the mood. This wasn't just dinner, it was an opportunity to change everything. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, a sense of calm settling over me as I surveyed the work I had done. I had turned what was once a simple task into something extraordinary. For the first time in a long time, I was proud of myself, not because of what others thought, but because I had done this all for me. As the guests arrived, I could feel the air shift. The usual tension that came with family gatherings was palpable, but I refused to let it affect me. I greeted my mother-in-law with a warm smile, masking the nerves that still lingered beneath the surface. She raised an eyebrow as she glanced around the room, and I could tell that she was assessing everything, looking for something to criticize. I could feel her gaze on me as I moved around the table, placing the plates in front of everyone with careful precision. She said nothing at first, but I could sense the subtle disapproval in her stiff posture, her gaze trained on me as though she were waiting for me to fail. But I wasn't going to let that happen. This time, I wasn't going to shrink in the face of her judgment. I wasn't going to apologize for my choices or my cooking. I was going to stand tall and show her that I was more than what she thought I was. As the first course, my lobster bisque, was served, I held my breath. I watched as my husband took the first spoonful, his face lighting up in surprise. "This is incredible," he murmured under his breath, not realizing I was watching him. But it was my mother-in-law's reaction that I was waiting for. She took a delicate spoonful, paused, and then nothing. She looked down at her bowl, slowly swirling the soup with her spoon, as though searching for something. Was it too salty? Too bland? Did she think it wasn't good enough? Then, finally, she spoke. "I'll admit, this is impressive." I had done it. I had gotten the first sign of acknowledgement from her. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The evening continued with little to no criticism from my mother-in-law, which was, in itself, a remarkable change. Every dish I served seemed to take her by surprise, and with each passing course, her tone shifted. Gone was the sarcastic, judgmental edge that she had always carried. Instead, I saw a woman who was slowly beginning to recognize the effort I had put into the meal. As the lamb was served, I could feel the tension in the room shift. My husband, normally reserved when it came to compliments, was practically beaming with pride. "You've really outdone yourself tonight," he said to me, his voice filled with admiration. I couldn't help but smile, the warmth spreading through me at his words. It wasn't just about the food. It was about knowing that I had created something special, something that had brought this family together. In that moment, I knew that my efforts had not only impressed my mother-in-law, but had also deepened my bond with my husband. But then came the dessert, the final test. The dark chocolate souffle, still warm from the oven, had a perfect, molten center. I could see my mother-in-law's eyes flicker with curiosity as I placed the plates in front of everyone. The room fell silent as we dug into the souffle. My heart raced as I watched my mother-in-law's face, waiting for her verdict. She took a bite, then another, her expression unreadable. At first I thought she was going to say something critical, but then, without warning, she set her fork down and sighed. "I have to admit," she said, her voice quieter than usual, "this is better than anything I've ever tasted. You've really impressed me." And just like that, the walls that had existed between us started to crumble. She may not have been ready to admit it right away, but I could see the recognition in her eyes. She no longer saw me as the woman who could never live up to her expectations. She saw me as an equal, someone worthy of respect. As the evening came to an end and my family began to leave, I stood by the door, bidding them farewell with a smile that felt genuine. The satisfaction that came from knowing I had accomplished what I set out to do was immeasurable. I hadn't just proven myself to my mother-in-law, I had proven something to myself. I had taken control of my own narrative and refused to let anyone define me. Later that night, as my husband and I curled up on the couch, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. "I told you," I said softly, my head resting on his shoulder. I knew I could do it. He kissed the top of my head, holding me close. "You were amazing. You've always been amazing." I smiled, feeling the weight of everything I had accomplished. It wasn't just about cooking. It was about reclaiming my confidence, my power, and my self-worth. I had finally proven that I wasn't just a wife in the shadows. I was a force to be reckoned with. And as I closed my eyes that night, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I would face them with the same determination and strength. I had found my voice, and no one could take that away from me. As the evening wore on, I could feel the tension in the air gradually lifting. My mother-in-law, who had once been so critical and unapproachable, was finally quiet. The disapproving expressions she wore like a permanent mask had softened. It was as though she was trying to process something unexpected. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It was about my strength, my effort, and my resilience. I caught my husband's eye across the table, and for the first time in a long while, I saw pride reflected back at me. He had always known what I was capable of, but seeing me stand up to his mother's harshness, quietly but resolutely, must have filled him with a new level of respect. "You're not a bad cook," he said to me later, his voice warm and affectionate as he reached for my hand. "You're incredible." His words felt like a balm to the wound that had opened the moment his mother insulted me. They were simple, yet exactly what I needed to hear. I squeezed his hand, offering a small smile. "I'm just tired of being underestimated." By the time dessert arrived, my rich dark chocolate souffle, now cooled and topped with a dollop of homemade raspberry coulis, the room had shifted entirely. No longer did the air feel heavy with judgment and criticism. Instead, there was an almost palpable sense of curiosity. It was as though my mother-in-law was finally allowing herself to taste what I had been trying to offer all along, not just a dish, but a glimpse into who I really was. I watched as she picked up her fork and dug in, eyes narrowing as she took the first bite. The room held its breath. I could see the delicate tension in her posture, as though she was waiting for something to go wrong, waiting for me to falter. But I didn't. I had perfected this dish, just like the others. She didn't speak right away. She took another bite, then another, and by the time she set her fork down, her face had softened. "This," she began, her voice unusually quiet, "this is really something. I didn't expect it." I could feel my heart swell in my chest. I wasn't doing this for her approval, but hearing those words from her was a kind of victory I hadn't known I needed. She had always seen me as beneath her, as less than. But tonight, I had stood tall and proven that I was more than capable. "You've really outdone yourself," she continued, this time with genuine admiration in her voice. I can't remember the last time I had a meal this good. The night ended with a kind of quiet resolution. My mother-in-law, for all her biting remarks and sharp criticisms, had finally seen me as more than just a shadow in her son's life. She had tasted my effort, my perseverance, and my skill, and she had finally acknowledged it. As I cleaned up the table later that night, I couldn't help but smile. There was a new energy in the house, a new respect, not just from my mother-in-law, but from myself as well. I had spent so much time doubting my worth, questioning my place in this family, trying to live up to her impossible standards. But now, I knew that I didn't need her approval to feel valid. I had proven that to myself. When my husband came to join me in the kitchen, he wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "You were amazing tonight," he said softly. "Not just in the kitchen, but in how you handled everything." I leaned back into his embrace, feeling his love surround me. "I did it for me, not for her," I whispered, the truth of it resonating deep within me. "And that's why you're amazing," he replied, kissing the top of my head. The dishes were washed, the kitchen was finally quiet, and I was left with a profound sense of peace. No longer would I let anyone, least of all my mother-in-law, make me feel small. I had earned my place at the table, and that was enough. Tomorrow would be a new day. But for now, I was content. I had learned the most important lesson: to never let anyone else's perception of me dictate my worth. As the evening drew to a close, I could see that the change in my mother-in-law wasn't just about the food. Something had shifted in her, something deeper than just culinary acknowledgement. Her eyes, once sharp and critical, now held a hint of something softer, something more open. She wasn't just recognizing my cooking, she was seeing me, really seeing me, for the first time. We finished the meal in a comfortable silence, punctuated only by the occasional clink of silverware or the rustling of napkins. It was as though the tension that had once filled every corner of the room had been washed away, replaced by a quiet understanding. And then, as the final course, my dark chocolate souffle with raspberry coulis, was served, I saw her pause. For a long moment, she simply stared at the plate, her fork poised in mid-air. The room was still, waiting for her verdict. Was she going to criticize it, call it too rich or too sweet? After all, this had been her pattern, to tear down anything that didn't meet her impossible standards. But this time she didn't. Instead, she took a bite. Another, and another. Each one slower than the last. The corners of her mouth twitched upward, a faint smile starting to form, as though the words she had been meaning to say were finally on the tip of her tongue. "You know," she said quietly, setting her fork down, "this is actually wonderful." She looked up at me, her gaze lingering for a moment longer than usual. "I was wrong. You're not just a terrible cook, you're incredibly talented." I had to stop myself from gasping. The words that had been so hard to come by, words that I'd spent years craving, had finally come out of her mouth. There, at that table, surrounded by the remnants of a meal I had poured everything into, I had earned her respect. But it wasn't just about the food, was it? It was about how I had risen above the challenges, how I had made my own space at this table, no longer allowing her harsh criticisms to define me. I had taken her judgment and transformed it into something powerful, something beautiful. "Thank you," I said, my voice soft but filled with a quiet triumph. I'm glad you think so. Later that night, as my husband and I settled in to relax after a long, exhausting day, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. It wasn't just about winning my mother-in-law's approval, although that had been a nice bonus. It was about me standing up for myself and reclaiming my own sense of worth. For too long, I had let the opinions of others, especially hers, shape how I saw myself. Now, I could see the truth. I wasn't just the woman who married her son. I wasn't just the bad cook in her eyes. I was capable. I was strong. And I was worthy of respect, whether she gave it to me or not. And that realization had come from within me, not from anyone else. As I lay in bed that night, the soft hum of the house around me, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in a long time. The fear of judgment, of not being enough, had finally melted away. It had been replaced by a quiet confidence, a self-assurance that I had earned, one dish at a time. My husband's arm around me brought me a sense of comfort, his presence a reminder that I wasn't alone in this journey. "You were amazing tonight," he whispered, his voice full of admiration. "I did it for me," I replied, my voice filled with certainty, "not for anyone else." He kissed the top of my head, and for the first time I felt fully seen, fully appreciated, not just by him, but by myself. I didn't need anyone else's approval to feel worthy. I had earned my place in this family. And I was going to hold on to that confidence, no matter what came next. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, of course. There would always be moments of doubt, times when people, maybe even my mother-in-law, would try to chip away at my sense of self. But I knew now that I was strong enough to handle whatever came my way. I had proven that I could rise above it all, and that was something no one could take from me. As I closed my eyes, the last thought that crossed my mind was one of quiet triumph. I had shown up for myself, and that was more powerful than any criticism or judgment anyone could ever throw my way. I had found my voice, and it was louder, stronger, and more confident than ever before. And that, I realized, was the true victory.